Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Hello, and welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook podcast. I'm your host, Robin Hunicke, and I'm here today with Kimberly Voll, who's the co-founder, designer, and coder at Stray Bombay Studios. And I wanted to talk with her a little bit today about what it means to be building a new game company in today's world, and also what it's like to be charging ahead in new frontiers in AI and gameplay especially. So welcome to the podcast, Kimberly. Nice to have you here.
Thank you so much, Robin. Super exciting to be here. It's an honor to sit and chat with you. So thank you.
As we were just saying in the warm up, it's been since the before times that we actually have seen each other in person. How have you been? How are you? Where are you in this world, and how are you in this world right now?
Oh gosh, I feel like there's the COVID standard answer, which I'm COVID good. Yeah. And then there's like, okay, well, how much time do you really have?
Where in the world are you right now?
So I am back home in Vancouver, Canada, actually,
nice.
Very recently. Yeah. So I've been off adventuring in the US, which has been awesome. I spent several years living down in LA when I was working at Riot, and then more recently, in the last couple of years, I kicked off a new company with my friend Chet Falsek, and we situated that in Seattle. So I moved up there. And then, of course, with the pandemic and just everything, it kind of started to make more sense as we were realizing we were going to stay a remote studio, that I wanted to be back closer to my family and whatnot. So yeah, here we are back in Vancouver.
So tell me a little bit about that journey, the beginning of the journey. I mean, obviously Riot, huge experience there. How did you break into the games industry and end up where you are now?
Yeah, so in some ways I've been in games for a ridiculously long time, which is kind of, it's kind of insane, or pardon me, it's kind of, it's hard sometimes to think back and realize just how long I've been in and around games.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. But, I think looking back, my earliest sort of memories of games were more just, I think for a lot of us, as they were making games and playing games and just sort of starting to take those first early steps into, hey, I really like this thing that I'm playing, and look at these interesting tools and things that I could poke at, and maybe I could start to make a game myself. And so, as some of my very first memories are back in the early 80s, poking at my TI 99 4A, and my parents would go get me books out of the library, and I didn't really know what I was digesting. I just knew that if I parroted what was in that book, then the computer would do an interesting thing, and then bit by bit, as I got older and understood more of it, I would change bits and pieces, and then eventually was writing my own chatbots and whatnot. And so my start in games was very much from a hobbyist perspective. And I think one of the interesting things for me was just how much that was ingrained in me as being the limits of what I could do in the games industry. It was just like, yeah, it's a fun thing I do on the side. And meanwhile, I'll go get a real job. And I think that's, defined a lot of my path in the industry, in that I have done a lot of other things prior to being full-time in games, because it always seemed like it had to be this side thing, because, for various reasons, I wasn't thinking of it as a real career. And so my actual kind of career aspects of that were, I started, when I was in university, I started doing some testing. I think back sometime in the 90s, I was doing some testing for EA. And then I was doing a little bit so my background's a combination of cognitive science, so the brain stuff, why we do the things that we do, as well as computer science and AI. And so with my undergraduate degree being cognitive science, I always had a really strong interest in video games, and how the intersection there with how we thought about and processed the world, and what that meant for video games. And so I found myself with a few early opportunities. I was really lucky, just with great professors and whatnot, to do a little bit of light consulting as an undergraduate. And then from there, I went on to actually become a professor. So I taught computer science for a long while, and then was making games on the side, and had a little kind of alternate, I guess, life doing indie games. And then, about I want to say about 10 years ago, I inverted that and I moved full time into the industry. And then shortly thereafter, that was when Riot reached out to me and tried to persuade me, obviously successfully, to come down to LA. So that was sort of that early genesis. It's like a little bit of a collection of different contributing factors. But yeah, it was kind of, games just hadn't really occurred to me as this thing that I could be doing full time. And so I pursued another career that I was passionate about, which was teaching, and did games on the side. And then that paved the way for me to invert that over time.
It's funny, you're probably the closest aligned with my own trajectory as well, because I was in grad school for years doing AI and robotics and gaming. And then I decided to not go the route of becoming a professor because I felt like I really wanted to get into games, but specifically because I was such a fan of The Sims. And I think if it hadn't been for getting recruited onto The Sims, I probably would have ended up doing something very similar. I think at the time that we were coming up, it didn't really feel like it was a viable career. Maybe the industry felt kind of small, or, the games were not really as research oriented as we had wanted. When you decided to go to Riot, was there something that hooked you there? Like, did they have an interest like in AI that made you think like, okay, this is the time for me?
Yeah, so they reached out, and they reached out to join at that time their player behavior team. And there was a lot that was really interesting about that, because I had, because I've got this foot in sort of the cognitive science side and this foot in the AI and computer science side. And I've always been very passionate and interested in kind of that intersection of people and tech, and like both the sociological impacts of games on society and the impact of society on games. Like that relationship for me is very fascinating. And here was League of Legends, which, at the time was, I want to say around 100 million monthly active users. And they were dealing with this fascinating problem, which was when you have people at scale in competitive spaces with impoverished communication.
They're not nice.
Stuff happens. And they were very, very laudably trying to improve the state of things and had done some really interesting things. And it was the first time that I had encountered in my career, outside some of the stuff that I had done, with Valve, that was really motivated from what if we take what we know about humans and how humans work and combine that with what we know about making games? Not that those are distinctly unrelated. I mean, they're very related, but like really trying to pull from both fields and marry it into something that, could ultimately, not to overstate it, but in many respects could ultimately just make the world a better place. And I just thought there was just such an opportunity there to pull the things that I was passionate about and I had been studying and learn from other folks that had been working in this space. And so
it's really fascinating, because it's like, this was a very incredibly difficult time just for everyone in games in general, right? It was like it was fraught with a lot of communication issues in the wider community as well as in the specific game communities. And like, it's so awesome that you were able to sort of step into a role that you could immediately have an impact and just really make a difference there. I think a lot of us at that time felt, the best we can do is make games that don't encourage this kind of behavior. But then really, when you look at it, it isn't just the gameplay. It's like, it's the community design, it's the onboarding, it's the moderating. Like, what do you feel like were some of the key lessons that you learned when you made that shift into trying to go from theoretically thinking about it to like concretely changing it?
Oh my gosh, it was so humbling. And, I'm really grateful to have been with Riot on that journey, because I think they had done some really great early work that was awesome, because they had prioritized it, which is in and of itself was a relatively unique thing at that time, and I think that we've grown a lot as an industry and as a society. But, early on, it was very much like, oh, well, that's just the internet, and there was this just defeatist, or at least acceptance of this is the state of the world.
Yeah, like boys will be boys.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And it's just like, oh gosh, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but one of my defining moments prior to Riot was sitting in a meeting with someone discussing a survey that had just gone on, a survey of players. They literally said that we could throw away the results from all the female players because that clearly wasn't their demographic. Never mind that there were all these results from female players that were actually playing the game, but And so this was just like, oh my gosh, it was one of those moments. Like I had several of them, but that was a big one that really stood out to me. And so there's just like all of these really, really interesting things. So to go down to Riot and be at a place that was like, well, let's look deeply at this. There's probably more than meets the eye here. And this is important because, Riot, they've very much got a strong value system of players first. And they really do authentically try to make players be at the forefront of every decision. And this was one of the ways that I thought that really stood out to me, and it really resonated with me.
So were you, I was just gonna say, so as an advocate for looking at it in a more nuanced way, like what were some of the takeaways that you had?
Yeah, I think the big thing was, there's a tendency to be very understandably reactive to the behaviors that you see because, they can be pretty terrible. They're pretty affecting, when you jump into a game and, when you've spent your life playing games or you're taking your first few steps into games. I mean, they have this incredible potential to be this very welcoming space, a space that when I think is realizing its full potential is an incredibly diverse and inclusive space. And yet here we were seeing all of these breakdowns. And what really stood out, I think, was the reasons behind it. Like when you really started to go deep, it wasn't just, I think at that point, a lot of the industry was like, well, people are just toxic or people are, it's just this very kind of paint it all with one brush. And if we just got the toxic people out of the game, then we would fix it. And as you dug deeper, you realized that this is not, there's this one group of bad actors, and if we just exit them from the community, it'll all be magically okay. What we're really seeing is this incredible reflection of the very tapestry of humanity, like we are seeing ourselves as the human race playing out in these digital spaces. And that became so fascinating. It's like, okay, well, why? And, it turns out, well, humans are messy. And so when you gather with folks, often across cultural barriers and in impoverished communication spaces, and with the added layer of competition and people, whether the stakes are high or not, they're perceived as being high stakes. And then you add to that all sorts of cognitive biases and breakdowns in communication and just different assumptions about why you're here or your expectations for the type of experience. And it turns out it's all of those things. And then you add a backdrop of the game design and the overall atmosphere and the ways in which we are fostering some of these behavior patterns through the examples that we're setting in the game and the unintended sources of friction. Like it just became it blew up into this incredibly rich substrate with which we felt like, oh boy, we could work with this.
As someone who's for my lifetime been really fascinated by human behavior and why people do the things that we do, I've always really come back to, the Upanishads, which is essentially that, what you think becomes what you say, and what you say becomes what you do, and what you do becomes your impact on the world, right? And like it gets down to this deep question of like watching ourselves as a society collectively through networked systems where people can express. I mean, it doesn't have to be games, right? It can be Facebook or TikTok or anything really. Clubhouse now, like whatever the flavor of the month is for reflecting upon ourselves as a society. You see that you have to set the right intention from the very beginning. Like you have to build the right thought into the player before they're acting and speaking and doing this kind of harm. And that comes really from the root, which is the design, right? From the very beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said. I think so much of this is really, it's just rethinking how we look at game spaces. I think historically games have been thought about as a very individual, a very single player experience, even multiplayer experiences, like all of the design decisions are largely to support the individual experience and have that person engage and keep coming back. And adding humans to that mix is just another tool for driving that engagement. But we haven't really matured to the point where we have developed tools and practices for really thinking about what are the implications for when you have multiple humans, when you have multiple minds in these spaces. What does it mean to design to play well together versus just play well? And I think that's the crossroads we've been at. And there's been a lot of really great work in the last few years that have matured our understanding of that. But the first thing was really just, and this is in process. I think there's a long way to go, but I think that it's starting that first step into saying, as developers, as designers, we have this suite of tools that we use to motivate and engage folks. And if we turn that to the problem of helping folks have successful interactions and thinking about defining success of a game in part by the quality of those interactions within that space, I think we open up a huge toolbox of opportunities there that we can start to build out when that becomes a priority.
This is like it's so central to the mission of making content that connects people. Like, even if you look at even just something really basic like Journey, which is just two people who can't talk to each other and can't chat, right? Like, only have a very limited number of tools with which to communicate with each other, but rely upon one another. Like, when people ask me like, wow, that's so elegant, or such a simple design, how did you come up with it? The answer is by not doing 99% of the things that we could have done and constantly arguing about what really creates value for two people to be intimate in a space together if they've never met. And when you look at something like Tinder, and you go, okay, what are the mechanisms of communication? How many options are open? How are we communicating with each other from the very beginning? Versus something like Journey, you see automatically like, wow, like the minute that you allow even one extra vector, you get all this potential for abuse, right? Like the minute that you allow someone to chat, then immediately they can say disparaging things to you about your photos. The minute that you allow them to share photos, the minute that they can share photos with you that you don't want to see. And it's such a difficult process to come up with a safe network of activities for players, especially when, like you said, they're used to playing well and not thinking about others, right? Like that their primary concern is winning, not necessarily making other people feel great. And I think it's really exciting that now there's a whole suite of tools available to us that we can use to track data, like look at the way that players behave, and then to set those metrics. So like, were you able to set metrics internally that you felt quantified and qualified that experience of connection and like integrity in the community? Like, because I think that's something that a lot of people listening to the podcast would love to know about, right?
Yes and no. So I think some of it was we were in a period of maturation as well in terms of our understanding and metrics. There's so many interesting qualifications or considerations when it comes to how you measure this, because exactly like what you said, when you look at people in these spaces, you can dramatically limit the touch points for interaction as a way of sort of controlling some of that inevitable kind of pushing of those boundaries. But when you kind of zoom out and you think about it, and that's a totally valid way to approach it. And oftentimes that is the best way to approach it in a context. But
it's limiting, right? It's not expansive. Yeah, it's not. It's actually it was innovative at the time, but I think now it stands as an example of one very minimalistic approach to the problem.
Yeah. And I think it was very revelatory in how it underscored the success you could have with that limited set. And then I think it focused the question on then, when we drop folks into a situation where it's completely open, it goes off the rails. When we limit it, it seems to be okay. And, we need to be somewhere in between. And in fact, it's not just a find the right set of tools. It's actually, I think, stepping back and recognizing that there is a trust deficit and that we have to actually foster trust over time, and that we don't get it for free. And that part of our job as the designers of these experiences is to create the scaffolding that allows this trust to form and not push players past its limits. Yeah. And that's just an incredibly hard problem because, in some games you're jumping in with your friends, and other games you're jumping in with strangers. Sometimes it's a mix. Sometimes, there's so many different variables at work there. And I think a lot of the choices that we make in the average game, I don't think this is an intentional choice, but they act to dehumanize others. And so if you kind of look at real life, forgive me, I don't even like using that expression. I think IRL is actually a phrase because it's all real life. Games are absolutely real life.
Totally.
we look in non-digital spaces and how we coexist successfully. And again, there's limits of that success, but more successfully, I think what we see is there are social tools, a lot of which is unconscious, some of which is conscious, but we have mechanisms for organizing around certain sets of values. We have ways to say, I don't know, if we go out to the playground together and I grab your ball and I throw it out of the park, there's checks and balances in place that are going to give me some much needed feedback that maybe wasn't a good thing to do, and respond to that. And I think people have more empowerment in these situations. And again, there's lots of problems there. But if you then look at that in the context of a digital space, so much of that is gone. Like there's very few tools to actually enact that sort of check and balance system. There are, where you might be in a situation where you're kind of looking out of the corner of your eyes to see what everyone else is doing. You can't do that in a digital space. There's no way to bubble up that this thing that this person just said was not okay. Like, I don't know, it's just got set into a vacuum and now I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah, and then you're hearing that feeling around like, oh, I should have said something or maybe I didn't. And then that leads to longer term damage, right?
Absolutely. And all of that just breeds that atmosphere that then normalizes and repropagates this type of behavior. And if you look at children too, it's a similar thing, where I think we have a lot of opportunity is to be looking at how we are fostering the next generation of successful, forgive the phrase, but digital citizens effectively.
Oh, totally. I mean, this is why I'm so fascinated by Roblox and why we're working in that space now, because I feel like it's happening. And in many cases, it's happening without necessarily looking at some of the work that has been done in the space. Like if you look at Project Horseshoe, for example, right, there's been several reports that have come out of their work on, staging relationships between strangers to friends, proximity, similarity, reciprocity, disclosure. Like there is research that's been done, in the early online environments. Like, one of the things that Raf Koster is so famous for saying, right, is that we learned all this stuff the hard way, 20 years ago when we were building Ultima and EverQuest. Like, why don't we just continue to learn from it? And I think the answer is that there's also kind of a lack of information sharing. Like if you are a design nerd like you or me or Dan Cook or Raf, you know that these things exist. But like the majority of people that are in the industry, I think, especially now as it becomes so huge and the barrier to entry is so low, if you're building a game on Roblox and you're 16, what are the chances that you've ever thought about proximity and reciprocity or disclosure? You haven't even had a relationship yet. How could you possibly, And so what I'm fascinated by is the importance of and the necessity of building these models, but also doing stuff like this where we talk publicly and disclose this stuff in a way that younger developers and designers who didn't have to live through the nightmare times can avoid history repeating itself, And I think it's really great. So like in addition to working on the games, you've been working with the Fair Play Alliance. Like, can you talk a little bit about what that means to you, like, and how you've tried to institutionalize and then share this kind of learning?
Absolutely. So the Fair Play Alliance is a cross-industry initiative that basically it's a global initiative that pulls together, we have over 200 gaming companies today are members. It pulls together the industry around the shared quest of how do we actually foster healthy interactions by design. So really, we stepped back when let me step back for a moment. So we founded it back in 2017 when I was at Riot. This is myself and a couple others, after we'd had a lot of shared conversations around the same types of issues about what we were working on and what we were seeing, and same thing, pulling a lot of that shared research and recognizing that there was not this same level of shared understanding around these techniques as there might be in other aspects of game design, say. And after we'd had enough of these conversations and were ourselves having conversations with other groups, we realized, there's kind of a core community of practice here that is working in this space. And wouldn't it be spiffy if we could just chat and share some of these ideas so we're not reinventing the wheel? And that was largely the genesis. And so we had a kickoff meeting. I think there were, 25 or 30 people at that initial convening. And within a year, we were up to 100. Like, it was just clear that this was the right time to be focusing in this space. And from the get-go, there's some amazing, I think, groups out there that are doing fantastic work on advocacy and more work closer to lobbying and those sorts of things. We were very much of, hey, the problems that we're facing, the opportunity that we see here is, while there might be authentic interest in doing better on the part of these gaming companies, very frequently it's one of two things that is holding it back. A lack of, and it boils down to a lack of empowerment, right? You're not empowered with the right tools or practices to know even what to do. It's like, oh, I want to make this better, but I have no idea. Or you're not empowered because you have, your stakeholders are not bought in with this as a priority, or you are up to your eyeballs in a million other things that help keep the lights on that draw players, and you're like, well, now this becomes, how do I make space for this when I don't even know what I'm doing on top of that? So it was just this really clear opportunity for us to say, well, maybe we could share our learnings and use where we're at in the industry to pull out from others and kind of create a shared central knowledge store that is not, it's not us giving it to the industry. It is us, the industry, saying, here's what we're learning. And we pull from experts all over the place and try to compile and create this shared space for knowledge and knowledge sharing.
It's just so fascinating because I feel like at the same time that this started happening, you also started to see people creating funds to invest in women and people of color. And you saw like the One Up Fund, for example, started being talked about around this time. And by the time you hit 2019, people really were taking a much more systemic approach to changing this reality in our community. And I don't know if you get this all the time, but I certainly am always being asked by people like, how bad is it in gaming? How oppressed are you as a woman in gaming? Or, how terrible is it from, underrepresented folks or queer folks and trans folks in gaming? And, my response has been, if you look at the amount of change and concrete efforts that we've made in the last 5 years, since, we've really suffered through this really difficult period of not having addressed community issues and not having addressed communication issues, like what you said, communication poor environments where you have a lot of people together, but the company isn't necessarily interfacing at that level. We've made a massive amount of change in a very short period of time. And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to become thought leaders in the space, which is only appropriate because, platforms like cloud gaming platforms, Roblox, whatever else comes from Fortnite and so on, like these are going to be the tools of the future, and they're already connected and highly community oriented, and they're training people to be digital citizens, whether they like it or not, So I think it's actually really fantastic that we've seen all these vectors, and like you decided at some point, like you were going to take the leap with Chet and like make a game in this space. Like, was it the result of like doing this work with Fair Play? How did you come to this conclusion? And like, what is fueling you now as you move into this next phase of making a difference here?
It was a lot of things, I think, that were driving it, but I think the big themes for me were wanting to, I've had a great experience at Riot. I have a lot of love for Riot, but it was still just, a very large company with some fantastic products that were well underway. And I think wanting to go kind of back more to my indie roots and be more at the ground level, really making things, I think was a big part of it. And in particular, trying to, so much of the work that we had done through the Fair Play Alliance that I think is really exciting, is still very much in kind of the early compiling. Here's what we know about human behavior and behavior in the context of games, and here's the latest that we understand on moderation. But there's this opportunity still, this huge space that is the upstream. How do we design more successfully in this space? And I wanted to kind of just get more to the ground level there and be thinking about that with the things that I was making, and make my own mistakes and learn from that as well too. I mean, not to set up that this is going to be the world's most magical game that we're making, but we certainly take it very seriously, and we're trying to structure things in a way that are allowing us to hopefully come out of the gate a little bit better, but either way still continue to learn from that and pull on all of this wealth of knowledge that as an industry we've been pulling together and try to carry that into a game company that is built from the ground up to try to be as thoughtful as to try to operationalize these values from the get-go, both in the ways that we work, which is its own bucket of challenges, and then to carry that through to our products. I believe very strongly, and I think this is one of the challenges we see as an industry, is that just like the things that you've been saying, historically we as an industry have had challenges with diversity. We continue to have challenges with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's kind of this weird sort of reflection back on itself, in that we matured partly because players were rightfully standing up and saying, enough, this is not okay, what's happening in these games. But when we look at that problem set and we try then to sort of say, well, what values do we want to see in these games? It's fascinating how often I now have conversations with companies, or individuals at companies, that when they're looking back at their own studios, they're like, well, these aren't the values that we work by.
Yeah, we don't live by these values, so how can we embrace them in the community?
Yeah. So I think it's created this really interesting momentum on the inside of studios to say, okay, hold on, maybe we need to rethink this, because at the end of the day, if these values are not consistent, we're going to continue to step on our own feet in these efforts.
So how did you get hooked? Like, did Chet just pitch you? What was what's your origin story?
Yeah, so I've known Chet for a long time, like, I don't know, 10 years or so. Back in the day when I was up in Vancouver, when I was teaching and then doing indie stuff on the side, I would often go down to Valve and do various things. I was very early on involved in a lot of the VR stuff. I was part of a group that made the fantastic contraption game for VR and just did a lot of early experimentation. And through that, got to know Chet really well. And we just had so many conversations about, state of the industry and development. And we talked a lot about cooperative games and the social aspect of games. And, my kind of big focus, I think, really, especially in the last 4 or 5, probably longer now, but for several years now, I've been just reflecting on this. I think of it as this great inversion, where back in the 70s, we'd go, 70s and 80s, you'd go into your rumpus room or whatever, your living room, and, you would gather around the console and play games. It's kind of this inversion where today we go into the games and that's where we gather.
Yeah.
Fascinating to me, especially when you look back at the history of games. I think they're really coming into their own as being a space, as being mature social spaces. These are our modern town squares and the malls of the 80s and 90s. And, so we would talk a lot about those kinds of things, and that it really, from our perspective, required a different way to think about games. And then, of course, obviously he did a lot of great work with his team on Left 4 Dead, which I think has continued to be a really great example of first person shooter that is actually pretty comfortable to play from the perspective of like human interactions. Not perfect, there's
there's still always that one person that headshots everybody right at the end,
there's stuff, but it was really interesting to see mechanically some of the choices that they made that biased folks toward more positive interactions. Like we're never going to fully cure society, because that is what we are, but I think it is learning how to set the conditions to bring out the better behaviors, which become then more normative, and then those normative behaviors propagate better behaviors.
I think that it's even more than that. It's that you have to sort of help people understand what part of the community practice of playing together is fantasy and what part of it is social. I think it really comes down to being able to sort of say, okay, this part of the game where we're all performing together to beat the monster, this is the fantasy part of the game. But then after that part is over, when we split up the loot, this is like social. It's like, this is the part of the game that's a negotiation between us as individual people in the space. And like when I high five you after you make a touchdown, I'm being social with you. It's not part of the gameplay. And if I don't appreciate you after we do something awesome, that in and of itself is a commentary. And I think people need to learn, as we innovate and create new spaces, they need to learn the difference between like you said, playing well and playing well together. And they're really, I think there's a lot you can do, right? To give people this sense of understanding of like what mode we're in. Like when we put our cleats on and we go out on the field, if I want the ball and I'm on your team and I don't pass it to you and I score, there is something there, right? There's a little bit of a competitive edge. Whereas if I choose to pass it to you and you score, I'm also a little bit a part of that play, right? And that's a choice. It's like you said, it's a human choice. At any given moment, the sportsmanship, quote unquote, of the player, it shines through their behavior, right? And it's not something people get trained in when they pick up Roblox or like go join a Fortnite server, right? Like they haven't, there isn't a coach there telling them, hey man, next time try passing the ball,
Yeah, well, and it's often the opposite too. Sometimes I think a lot of the games that we play are fantastic games, but just have the unfortunate side effect of being a little bit antithetical to some of those goals. They're just fundamentally competitive games, and that means that we're going to be primed to behave in a certain way. Like even one of the really interesting challenges of League of Legends and MOBAs in general, I would say, is there's this. For those who aren't familiar, you're on this shared field and you all play a role that largely maps into a lane, and you're trying to push the advantage and take over the opposing side's base. And for the initial part of that game, the meta tends to play out such that you are each in your prescribed lane and you play in that lane a one-on-one battle with another player. And so here we have the first 5 plus 10 minutes or whatever of a game that is a largely individual experience. And then we transition into the mid stage of the game. And that's when it becomes, oh yeah, that's right, I have a team. So it's not bad. It's just recognizing what behaviors we're fostering by the core design and then looking for, maybe that is an important aspect of the game and we wouldn't want to compromise that because that it erodes what we think League of Legends is, but can we think of other ways that continue to humanize or lift up the fact that you're playing with other people? Can we look for those opportunities of reciprocity and build those in, and like what if we scaffold the successful interactions and just make it easier to be good to each other? I think those are the really rich opportunities for us.
Yeah, actually, I've been watching the Formula One series on Netflix with my partner, who's a big Formula One nerd, and we were just having this conversation the other day. I was saying, like, I find the drama of the soap opera of Drive to Survive so interesting because it is exactly that problem. You have two people driving cars on the same team, and one of them is usually the favorite and the other is usually an up and comer. But then there's all this physical constraint with the car and your body, and like just driving it alone is really hard. It's like the hardest video game you've ever played. and then on top of that, there's road conditions, and then there's the other teams, and then there's the physics of the car. And so there's so much uncertainty when you get into your vehicle that you, as a teammate, it's like all of the team stuff occurs in surviving to the point that you actually get on the road. But once you're in the car, you're competing against your teammate, just like you're competing against everybody else. And because the cars have to go so close together, and there's all these opportunities for small physical mistakes that can literally destroy any car that you touch, you end up in a situation where everybody is kind of like knives out in this one moment. But then you have to get out of your car and go back to the mechanics. And like, if you crash your teammate's car, you're costing your team, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And it's just, the stakes are so high, and the drama that ensues and the number of flip-flops and people leaving and psychological damage and fights. And it's like, it's the best soap opera, but I cannot imagine what it must be like to be a coach in that kind of environment, because you're not really coaching a team, you're coaching two potentially very dangerous people that are going to be constantly fighting with one another. And it's such a bad design, and yet it's fascinating to watch,
Yeah.
Which is, I think that's the other part of it, right? There's like a drama to the way that people compete that we get off on as a society. Like when we watch, I don't know, reality television, like when you look at, the very first, MTV, reality TV houses, right? It was exciting to watch these proto stars or proto influencers like be mean to each other. And like, what is it about that you think, like, I mean, you've thought about this a lot. Like, is that Is that inevitable? Is it something that we should leverage?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, yeah, there's a certain degree of inevitability to it. I think we are naturally attuned to those sorts of dramatic moments. I mean, partly because it's a little bit of the threat response, right? Like something's going down. I need to pay attention to this. And I think that there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of when you are observing it, certainly from an external perspective, you're doing so from a safer perspective too. So I think that allows us to engage with it a little bit differently, but also when you're in the moment, I mean, it's similar to just generally competitive experiences, right? There's this rush, and then the after effects of that rush tend to be what feeds that fuels that desire to jump back in there. But it does, it does fundamentally change the sort of our interpretive matrix of how we're receiving those experiences. Like if you are in a high stakes moment, then you're going to behave very differently with those who are sharing that experience with you than in a casual walk in the park type of experience. So I think that that's one of the ways in which I think games, I mean, are fascinating because of that. It tends to be a space where you're trying to climb the ladder, you're trying to rank up, you're trying to achieve this thing, you're finally like 3 hit points away from defeating this boss that you've never defeated before, when I show up and I don't know, screw something up, and now I've ruined everything.
Leroy.
So there's so much pressure there that gets in our way. And when you don't have a good foundation, I mean, even the best of friends in that context who do these things all the time can take each other's heads off when it's high stakes. And so, we're certainly in some contexts operating at a disadvantage in these spaces. So I think that's I don't know that they're, kind of to your question, like, it's not like I'm certainly not saying that those games are bad. I mean, I don't know. I'm a super competitive person.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I guess I'm in there too. But I think it's just more recognizing what we have to work with and then saying, okay, well, I'm always a big fan of saying, know what your core experience is, know what your pillars are, know what the game is that you're making or have made. And then recognize the trade-offs that come with those decisions, because that gives you the space with which to work. And so if you are a highly competitive game, know that is going to introduce certain aspects of friction on how your players relate to one another. And if you're a game more like Animal Crossing, that's going to give you some different materials to work with, some things that are going to be more in the favor of healthier interactions organically. But it's not an easy black and white sort of space. It's really just understanding what you're working with, and then the expectations and things that players bring to those, along with our understanding of just like what does lead to successful interactions. What can we provide to players that lessens the reliance on trust and gives space for it to grow.
It's really interesting. My nephew started playing Animal Crossing when he was 5 during the beginning of the pandemic, and he couldn't read yet. And we would get online together, and I'd FaceTime him, and we would do social through the iPad, and then I would go to his island, and he would be like, Aunt Robin, come here, Aunt Robin, come here. And then over time, as he learned to play Animal Crossing with a child his age, and then started reading and then understanding the systems, his behavior really changed. So like the first time we played together, it was just his island was just a tent and then just littered with stuff. It was just like a playroom, right? Like where there was just shit everywhere. And over time, he started building houses and getting money, and then learning how to do, terraforming and, all the stuff. And just the other day, I happened to just call home. He was getting put to bed, and he immediately associates me with playing Animal Crossing. So he said to my brother, "Tell Aunt Robin that I cleaned up my island. It's all clean now." Like his perception of me, as an adult, is that I would appreciate a very well organized, functioning town where he's built a lot of stuff, and he has far surpassed me. Like my island is a disaster. It's probably filled with bugs, and I haven't gone back. I think it was Ian Bogus tweeted about, it was about a month ago, like, how much money would you pay to avoid the public shaming and disaster cleanup of returning to an abandoned Animal Crossing island? And it's like, yeah, I would definitely pay $100 not to have to feel that. But like, he's definitely become a game player in the space of Animal Crossing. And it really makes me wonder, like, when he does finally go online into another system, whether it's Minecraft or Roblox or whatever, or eventually if he plays a game like LOL, will it have informed his fundamental structure? Do you think that people are transitive in their relationships with content, or do you think that the content sets up its own universe for people?
I think to a certain extent, definitely transitive. I think there are certain experiences that are pretty strongly defined in the sense that you're very distinctly in a different type of space, and so that's going to drive certain behaviors. If you're going from Dark Souls to Animal Crossing, I mean, those are distinct enough that I think there's the extent of that transference is probably moderated by the type of environment that you're moving to and from. But I do think more generally speaking, there is that transitive aspect. And I think that's actually an important quality of how we think about societally improving, more generally across the board in digital spaces, and looking at the next generation and how we're setting them up for success. Because I think there's two challenges that we're facing. One is, are we doing enough? I think the answer is no, but I am so eager to be proven wrong. But are we doing enough?
I think that's fair.
Yeah. But are we doing enough to actually set kids up for success? Are we teaching them what it means to have successful interactions, how to respect one another? Are we reinforcing as the adults and caregivers that are setting these examples, are we reinforcing that these are human beings that they're playing with in the case of online multiplayer games? And are we providing a humanizing effort to that end, and teaching kids how to behave and how to demonstrate resilience and how to not, and as a kid, to this day, I'm still obsessed with board games. And I would play a ton of games when I was a kid, but I didn't particularly like playing with my brother, no offense, because he would, if he ever lost, he was younger than me, so I suppose I should give him a pass, but if he ever lost, he'd just throw the board. And eventually,
traumatic.
But that's the sort of thing that are we still imbuing those lessons in digital spaces? And then I think the second thing is, when you think about sending your kids off to play at the park, there's a whole series of things that you're considering about the safety and their ability to be successful in those spaces. And are they old enough to go off on their own? Are you going accompanying them? And just all of, there's just so many different things that we think about. And do we bring the same care and attention to the online spaces? Because in a lot of the work that I have done with teachers and caregivers looking at these aspects, it's become quite apparent that kids still feel that these are not respected spaces, and that if they see something, it doesn't have to be bad. It could just simply be, hey, I saw a thing that I don't understand. Their instinct is to go to their peers who are, roughly at the same development level, rather than to a trusted adult to say, hey, I saw a thing. And so we're losing those teachable moments with kids to say, actually, that's not okay. And so they become, they're trying to figure it out among their own peer group, assuming they're even talking about it at all. And that provides its own, I think, fuel for normalizing some of these unhealthy behaviors that we
It's really fascinating. We've actually been building a character into one of the experiences that we're building on Roblox specifically to address this kind of issue. And that, thinking of it as an ability to have almost like a Dropbox where you can just leave a note that is like, a question or a concern or whatever, that will give people a safe way to explore that stuff with a moderator that isn't a child, and really to try and scaffold those behaviors into learning environments, give teachers the tools to be able to do that. It happens even in college, it happens when I'm teaching classes at university level, right? Some people will just have an uncomfortable moment in a group setting, and then they don't necessarily know if it's something that they should report, right? And it really, even just the basic concepts of consent, like it's something that you have to teach to university level students when they come on campus. You need to have a really direct, concrete conversation with them about what is consent and what does it mean, and what are situations where you have to ask for it, and what are situations where if you don't give it, you should say something. And like, it's a huge issue in society in general, but like specifically, I think it's a really rich place to be, in gaming. So what
Mhm.
can you tell us about what you're working on? Can we get a scoop? Like, are you allowed to say anything? Are you still under wraps? Are you hiring? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, so we're still mostly under wraps. We're getting very close to announcing, but yeah, we're working on we're a studio built on cooperative experiences, and so we are working on a 4-person cooperative game. I can't say a lot more yet, so I'll just leave it as a really annoying, obnoxious teaser. But I will say that we've tried very hard to carry our learnings and experiences forward into this instantiation of the studio. And, I say that with care because we certainly have not got all the answers. We certainly have not figured things out. And we, like many, have struggled with COVID and understanding ways to create to realize the values that we want to see true in our studio, in a fully remote studio, et cetera. And so we've got a lot that we're learning, but certainly what we're trying to do very much is build a studio from the ground up that really does create as best we can a space that is supportive of the values that we think are important. So, compassion and building psychological safety and honesty and care and, respect for not just people's well-being and time, but also appreciating all of the different insidious underminers that exist in studios. And that certainly each of us in the studio, we're 18 people today, each of us comes with our own journey and the impacts that had on us, and just trying to find a way to be compassionate toward one another and create a shared space and then carry those values into the game as well.
Well, that's awesome. As someone who has spent the last 8 years kind of working on that problem, I think that I have both empathy and sympathy for anyone that really does start a studio with these values. But I think in the long run, it's so invigorating what you learn about yourself, like you really,
oh my gosh, yes.
You really do learn so much about your own biases and your own needs as you navigate the process of putting together a team. And in many ways, it's like what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, succeeding at making a good game is for many people an ego-driven activity, and it can lead to the kinds of failures that we talked about with soccer players, right? Like it can lead to the failure of sharing authority or sharing power or sharing decision-making or being transparent because you want to be the one that wins in the meeting or in the context of, the reviews or whatever it is. And one of the things that I think is so hard about doing it with an original concept is that it is so uncertain, right? Like one of the reasons that Martin and I started with being a co-development studio, in addition to doing original content, was that it's a really great way to train people, to bring people up into the business where the stakes are a little less high and it's more focused on an external partner and meeting their needs, which leads to a sense of collaboration on the team for the shared goal of succeeding with the partner as opposed to succeeding by oneself. And I would definitely agree with you that like the baggage people bring into a team from their other experiences and the needs that they have is so influential in that space. So have you had any early learnings just like with respect to yourself and what your needs are in a working environment that you can share?
Yeah. Oh, lots. I don't know. I guess the couple of things that come to mind. I mean, one is just so much of this world, I think, seems to be influenced by insecurity in all of us. It just feels like so much of what ends up playing out is really just a deep-seated need to feel respected by your peers, and so much of the jockeying is that, and just knowing that, how do we create a space where, because at the end of the day, we can't make every decision by committee because we're never going to get anything done. And so how do you maintain decision velocity and still have everyone feel like they were heard and they were a part of these things, and that you are feeding their need to feel like an effective contributing member of the team, which we all deserve to feel. And so I think that just I've run lots of teams before, and I've been on a lot of much smaller indie projects and whatnot. And I feel like this has still somehow been one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Well, you're not alone. It's not you. Yeah. It's not unique to you. I can tell you that from all of the CEOs I've talked to and all the co-founders.
And I think it's partly because I mean, I certainly didn't enter into it like, well, I got this on lockdown. That was not true. I entered into it, I think, very humbly and very, from slightly terrified, like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? But I think just the realness, the visceralness of being, like when I was at Riot, I would do my very best to be available for folks and try to walk that walk the best of my ability. And even, if I found myself stuck, there were those folks that I could, there were folks above me, there were folks next to me, there were, there was just all of that. But I find as when you're, I mean, obviously it's myself and Chet, but like it's us, and it's like it all makes it up to us, and we just, both of us, I think, are united in this shared sense of wanting to create this space where if we can bring nothing else to the world, hopefully we can make for a better life for at least these 18 people and have that bleed out into the world in positive ways. But yeah, it's startling how viscerally I feel that. I don't think I was quite anticipating just that level of visceralness.
Yeah, when I founded Phenomena, I went to a bunch of my sort of old school game designer friends, like Noah Falstein and a bunch of the more senior people from LucasArts that I knew from forever ago, and Bob Bates and so on. And I said, like, what do I do not to screw up? And the first thing that I think it was Bob said to me was just get prepared to be the worst boss you've ever had, because you're going to beat yourself up about so many minuscule mistakes that were unavoidable. And like, I would tell you not to do it, but there's no way that it won't happen. It happens to everyone. You're going to feel ultimately responsible, and you're going to always worry about your run rate, and you're always going to worry about your people. And you just have to be prepared to be kind to yourself in those moments.
Yeah.
And learn what gets you through them. Like, is it scotch? Is it exercise? Is it your partner? Is it your co-founder? Like, is it just doubling down on research? Like, whatever it is that gets you through those moments, you've got to find what your brand is, and then do that. But be prepared, because it's the hardest thing about starting something is how hard you are on yourself. And so, if I could pass that on to you, I would just say, like, give yourself compassion, Kim. It's like, you really have to understand that it's part of the process. And also, like, give yourself credit. You're doing something awesome. You've made this leap, from academia into games, and then from games into founding, and like with the shared values with a partner that you care about and trust. And like, you're already ahead of the game compared to the vast majority of startups in the world, but even in gaming, right? Like, just having had the experiences that you've had, and bringing that to the community. So I think that's really awesome,
Well, I appreciate that a lot. And those are very sage words. It's been interesting too, just because you do the risk analysis of the whole thing. And I got to say, the one line item we didn't have on there was pandemic.
Yeah, nobody was ready for that one.
Nope. So, I think I think we're constantly reminding ourselves too, just to be compassionate to ourselves, because what a year it's been, and we're all crispy and learning to operate in this new reality, and a lot of the things that have served us before just don't work in this world anymore. And a lot of the way, I mean, maybe I'm just getting old, which is fair. I'm in my mid 40s now, but I think that there's a certain reality, pandemic or not, that is just where once I would just run at problems nonstop because I had that infinite well of energy.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I think, when we started, we said, okay, we're gonna expect 4 hours of focused work from everyone per day, because there's commute time and lunchtime and meetings and stuff. And then the pandemic, hits, and you go, all right, well, 4 hours a day would be exceptional if you've got kids at home, or if you're dealing with a family member who's in healthcare, or you have someone that's immunocompromised in your immediate circle that you're trying to be in a pod with. Like, it ends up actually it multiplies the amount of responsibilities that people have outside of their work context, without really reducing the expectation, especially, on the funding side sometimes with partners. And so it really does become an active and open conversation. Like, what is your mental health state? How are you dealing? Like, do you need a vacation? Like, I just had this conversation with someone yesterday. Like, if you need the time, just take it now, because there's never going to be a good time.
Yeah.
And you're it's not going to suddenly disappear, this stress. So let's take a real hard look at your tasks and your responsibilities and figure out what we can just say is, yeah, it's nice to have, it's not need to have. Because if you don't do that now, you'll just end up in the same place, but worse in 2 or 3 months, right? There's no other way to deal with it but to just
a loan you're taking out, you'll never pay back.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too, we try to be very transparent. I think that is an important aspect of the studio, but there's still that level of, but we still help set the tone, and so finding that right balance that is acknowledging that, yeah, this is a bit of a shit show. We get it. Like, oh my gosh. And just trying to stay supportive of that without just piling on additional stress, and like that's been an interesting needle to thread.
Yeah, the age-old question of how do you support people and acknowledge without dumping? How do you be transparent about challenges without triggering? This is like it's like parenting, but even more complicated, because there's a salary involved, and also, these people are adults, not children. It ends up just becoming a really nuanced discussion. I mean, I can't say for sure, but just from the conversation that we've had, I'm really, really, really looking forward to the game, and I'm looking forward to, hearing more about the studio as you guys get ready to unveil and launch. And, I mean, like I said, you're doing it with the right tool set. So, that's the best you can do. If you're doing the best that you can, you start with right thought, and then eventually you end up with right action. And that changes the world in a positive way. And we need more of you doing it. So
we are very excited when the time comes to humbly release it on the world and learn all that we can learn and grow from there. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking this hour to talk with me, Kim. It's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. You're right in the same lane, and I'm excited to be working in the same space as you, but also just to have another person leading and learning in the space and sharing with everyone, which is the way that we all get better at what we do. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. And likewise, it's been awesome.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.